author event series. My name is Alex Schaffner, and it's my pleasure to introduce author Alejandro Varela in conversation with Adam McGee. Before we begin, I'd like to note a couple things. First of all, thank you for everybody who's wearing your mask. That is something that we're requesting at this event, so we appreciate your help in making that possible. Second, thank you so much to everybody who has bought a book so far. If you haven't yet but would like to, they will be for sale back at that counter at the end of the event, and Alejandro will be signing them. And third, thank you so much for being here, whether you're in person or whether you're here virtually. By taking the time to participate in this event, you support not only a wonderful author, but an independent bookstore. And in doing so, you make us your independent bookstore. So thank you for being part of our community today, and thank you for supporting us and Alejandro's work. Now, welcome all. I'd like to take this moment to thank Adam McGee for being the moderator of tonight's talk. Adam is the arts editor and managing editor of Boston Review. He has a PhD in Black Studies from Harvard. His writing has appeared in Prairie Schooner, Electric Lit, Poets and Writers, Raleigh Review, Painted Bride, Memorious, and Cimarron Review. And we appreciate so much the insight and expertise he brings to this conversation. So Adam, thank you for being here. Now, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's guest author. Alejandro Varela is based in New York. His work has appeared in The Point Magazine, Boston Review, Harper's Magazine, The Rumpus, Joyland Magazine, and The New Republic, among others. He's a 2019 Jerome Fellow in Literature, and his graduate studies were in public health. So, a bit of a turn of purpose, and to the best possible effect. Tonight we celebrate Alejandro's debut novel, but this is only the beginning. His second book, The People Who Report More Stress, will be published in 2023. First, however, comes the town of Babylon, as a crackling, seemingly cynical protagonist overcomes his distaste for his own past and in the wake of a breakup, brings himself home to care for his father in the midst of an unwanted high school reunion. Buried in his over-eloquence and dismissal of his hometown are real pains, these of being queer and brown in a town that did not make either of these things easy to be. And buried in the suburbs of his youth is a surprise truth that not everyone fits the mold of this place as pristinely as he imagines. Not everyone exists in a comfortable parallel country overlaying his own and inaccessible to him. Although it may come down to him alone to protect his well-being and his future and heart, the past, now present, is complicated. And as he faces down old love, old friendship, old enmity, and their new truths, difficulties, and scars, his sense of the bonds between himself and the world around him begin to shift. I'm excited to welcome the author here tonight, so please join me in applause for Alejandro Varela.
Hello. Oh, you can hear me. That's fine, or do I need to get close? No, that's good.
That's good.
Okay. So, thank you for being here. Thank you to Booksmith for having me. Thank you to Adam and the folks here who came. I'm going to read a smallish excerpt from the book, but because it's about a third of the way into the book, I'm going to set the stage. And while I do that, do you mind closing your eyes? Thank you. All right. So the protagonist, Andres, is home to take care of his sick dad, who's recovering from surgery. Last night, on a whim, he attended his high school reunion after 20 years of not seeing anyone. Jeremy, an old friend, he insisted on selling him weed. Andres acquiesced, and now he's gone to visit him. Okay. You can open your eyes again. Jeremy lives on a block of two-story homes with small lawns, vinyl fences, driveways, and sickly maple trees, not far from St. Pete's, the elementary school. One block over is the street where a van full of teenagers opened fire on us with eggs and super soaker guns full of piss one Halloween. Our small group was unprepared for the onslaught of yellow. Mikey C., Paul, and I dove behind a hedgerow and only caught a bit of splatter on our costumes. Mike and I were Ghostbusters. Paul was Duff McKagan, the bassist of Guns N' Roses. But the rest of the pack had to run home to wash off the liquid detritus. I didn't recognize the assailants. Paul said they attended McKinley, the middle school named after the U.S. president who'd been shot by an anarchist. Public school kids were, back then, mythical creatures that I'd hear about in passing and sometimes meet at a block party or parking lot carnival. They were usually the poorer or less devout cousins and neighbors of my Catholic school classmates, troublemakers who peed into water guns. Most of the houses in this part of town clapboard siding, and they're painted off-white with red trim, dull blue with white trim, or beige with brown trim. There are no curbs or sidewalks in sight. Lawns end abruptly where the street's pavement begins. Small children bike loops or dribble basketballs on their driveways. Every few houses, flowers droop in their beds beneath big windows. Occasionally, there's an American flag. Always, there's one house that's in disrepair. That's where the kids with the ratty uniforms and slovenly parents tended to live. Nowadays, there are 2 of those houses per block. I've also noticed another trend: bigger, more ostentatious homes, mini McMansions, stuffed betwixt the older constructions. Whether this reflects wealth or non-union labor or materials made elsewhere for less, I don't know. Jeremy's lawn is small, but when it lacks in size, it makes up for it in verdancy. Water guns, a pedalless tricycle, and wiffle balls and bats are strewn about the recently mowed swath of green. A sprinkler oscillates 180 degrees, one side straight out, then the other. I park in front of his house, on the street, behind an angled black Nissan Altima. 3 of its tires are on the pavement. The 4th rests on the short cobblestone perimeter that encircles the lawn. I can't see what lies beyond the white fence that encloses the side and back of the house. It comes up above my forehead, and there is no visible space between the pickets. I imagine a small patio and an unkempt yard full of dog shit. My mouth is dry. It feels small and inutile. I shouldn't have taken a hit of the old pot, a dime bag that my sister-in-law Ellie slid into my stocking during our first Christmas together after Henry died, nearly 9 years ago. I've wedged it between 2 books, The Count of Monte Cristo and Summer of My German Soldier, in our old bedroom. The brittle, grayish herb retains some of its potency and most of its secondary effects. I am hungry in addition to cotton mouth. Before I knock, I prepare myself for the possibility of meeting Jeremy's wife. I wonder if she knows that her husband and I spent the last year of high school having sex in his parents' basement, and occasionally in my bedroom. Does she know that we loved each other? If they've been together for 10 years, it stands to reason that she's asked him about his adolescence, his first time, his first love. These are things that married people know about one another. I know them about Marco, my husband. His first time was with a college friend, who's now a well-known theater actor. They remain friends. I'm uncomfortable with it. And he knows them about me, but maybe Jeremy hasn't told his wife. He isn't a particularly loquacious or forthcoming person, or at least he wasn't. An onion with endless skins is what I remember. And maybe she suspects and doesn't want to risk the tears. Jeremy was always attracted to women and men. I pretended to be, but he actually was. His bi or pansexuality made me uneasy, primarily because I wanted both of us to feel exactly the same way about everything. But he had a way of making me feel like the center. It didn't matter if we were with friends or in class or at the prom. I knew that his eyes were trained on me, following me around the room, ready to wink in my direction. He was, at least in that way, the abiding star. In retrospect, it's unbelievable that our carelessness didn't betray us more often. I recall one time, he kissed me in an empty hallway, in the moment after the warning bell rang and our classroom sealed shut. As Jeremy ran away down the long blue corridor, I spotted Miss Van Estrin standing in the frame of her door, her face ruddy, nearly apoplectic. She said nothing to me about it, but then misgraded my physics exam a few days later. She claimed to have miscalculated, but I convinced myself I was being sanctioned. Frankly, I didn't care. I was infected. Jeremy's confidence was my first sexually transmitted illness. He made me, in a way, carefree. His affections and attentions transformed me into another person. I was popular, but he was cool. A cool kid with good looks and rough edges, who'd been in fights and played baseball, whose reputation cloaked our sins. If our ships sank, at least they would sink together. In the meantime, I spent senior year with outsized self-belief, feeling more attractive, funnier, taller even. One of the best-looking people I'd ever clapped eyes on cared as much about me as I did about him. For adolescent me, that was enough. Also unique was that Jeremy seemed assured about his feelings for me.
I love you.
He said as we were lying on his bed one night in January senior year. Both of us were in boxers, staring up at a 1986 Mets poster on his ceiling. He said the words without turning to face me. I remained quiet for at least 10 seconds, focusing instead on Mookie Wilson's name, forcing myself to wonder about its origins, buying time, trying desperately to control how quickly and loudly I might respond. But the ball of fire that had traveled up from my stomach was detained only briefly in my throat. I love you too,
Yeah.
he said, as if he were confirming what he'd already known. The 4:30 Northern Hemisphere sun strikes a wide angle in the summer, warming my neck and calves and lighting the modest house. I count 3 small beige sparrows with mustard beaks perched along the roof scudder. I knock once for each bird instead of ringing the cracked buzzer. It crosses my mind to run to my car. What, after all, are we going to talk about? I compiled a list of questions on the way over here, most of them silly, icebreakers really. Through the living room window, I see a shapeless figure move between shadows before I hear its footsteps. Jeremy appears behind the mesh of his screen door.
Hey.
Hey. His hair is darker and neater than it was last night. His pale face has a reddish tinge, as if he just showered with hot water. He's wearing jeans pulled up high on his waist and an unappealing lilac-colored polo shirt. He looks like a dad and a neighbor. He opens the screen door and steps forward, in the process allowing the sunlight to restore his humanity.
Give me a sec.
Jeremy inspects his mailbox and dislodges from it a few envelopes that have been forced into an opening that's too small.
Come in.
Should I take my shoes off? I ask after crossing the threshold.
What? Why?
I don't know, germs?
It's fine. Whatever you want.
Jeremy bisects a narrow rectangular living room and enters an equally circumscribed kitchen.
Something to drink? I got water, milk, orange juice, or pink wine.
He calls out with his head inside of the refrigerator. Pink wine. Who doesn't know rosé? I suspect he's uncomfortable saying the word, as if it'll emasculate him. I thought you didn't drink.
I don't. The wine is Tanya's.
It stands to reason that Tanya is his wife, but I don't ask for confirmation. Water's fine.
Ice?
Yes, please. He hands me a glass dripping with condensation and sits on a teal sofa across from the armchair I've already claimed. The blues and purples of his clothing and furniture are disorienting, as if his white arms and white face are floating, disembodied. So, where are...
Do you want... Sorry.
He says.
Go ahead.
No, nothing. I was just wondering where your family is.
Oh, Tanya took the kids to the pool at the high school.
Garfield? Another assassinated president.
Yeah, they have swim classes every day in the summer.
How old are they?
Ford is 7, Lincoln is 4.
Like the presidents or the cars?
What? Oh, Tanya named them both.
He says with a restrained smile. Maybe I've embarrassed him with my penchant for trivia. Will they be home soon?
The class just started, and she usually takes them to Athena's after.
They remodeled, I say. I noticed on the way over here.
Yeah, but it's still the same old diner, same menu.
I remember the French fries.
Still great.
We both smile until it becomes awkward. I look down at the ring of water on my shorts. I wipe the glass with the end of my shirt.
It's hotter up here. Let's go down to the basement.
He says. My childhood home didn't have a basement. The land here wasn't made for basements, my dad has claimed. But for a few $100s more, we could have had a garage. I'll regret that for the rest of my life. My mother, however, is grateful for the simplicity. Who would have cleaned this garage? They get moldy and fill up with junk. I've never seen a clean garage. I think it's a garbage, but they forgot to add the B. That's it. Thanks, Nima. Yes, please do.
This is awesome because I wanted to hang out with you for years, and so now I finally get to. These are my icebreakers
Oh.
that I.
For folks who don't know, Adam published a story of mine in the Boston Review about, this is the beginning of the pandemic, so a couple of
20, spring
19?
2020
Oh, spring
or
2020.
2019.
2019. We were in touch in 2019 and then it got published in 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think we talked before then even. I don't know, but there's been a
Well,
lot of emails.
You were like a finalist in our short fiction contest.
Right, that's right.
With your wonderful story that we then published.
Yeah.
But the whole world kind of fell apart. I think between the time you
Exactly.
entered and the time we published it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And now it sounds like it's going to be part of this.
Yeah, it's going to be part of,
novel.
yeah, so yeah, the next book, that's one of the stories in the next book, because the next book is a collection, but But yeah, anyway,
That's awesome.
yeah, that's how we know each other.
So I guess I just wanted to start by asking. So I read in an interview that you talked about the fact that this novel started at a moment when you were feeling kind of frustrated about trying to publish a collection of stories, and that the novel came to you really quickly. And I would just be curious to hear you talk about which part came to you first, and what it was that you initially thought the story was, and whether that's what the story ended up being.
Right. I was frustrated because I was trying to sell short stories, and short stories, according to the industry, don't sell. Not collections. Although every year I see collections are nominated for all the big prizes, and they do sell, but they don't sell as well as novels. That's true. Even a short story collection that wins the Pulitzer doesn't sell as well as like a kind of another just a novel. But I also took that to mean that your short stories aren't good enough, and which is fair. And but I really wanted to sell them. I thought there are enough here. I kept thinking of all the albums that win album of the year with like on the strength of one song. You know, I'm like, okay, they're not all great, but there's like 2 or 3 good songs here. This should be enough. I'm thinking of Celine Dion. Anyway, but it doesn't matter. And so I after the 3rd round of rejections, which by the way were all encouraging. Oh my God, we love your writing. It's so great. Could you write a novel? Could you put all the stories together and make one novel? It's like I've never heard of a novel with 12 plots, but that's fine. So I said no, and I was resisting. I was like, no, I'm not going to be the same tale, and then I ended up being the same tale because I got frustrated, and I sat down, and the editor who was most interested in the short story collection said, just give me a sample of a novel, and that'll be enough to get you a 2-book deal. So in 3 weeks, I wrote 6 chapters. And then I showed them to my agent, and he said, no, they're not ready. And my agent almost never has an opinion on my writing. So I lost confidence when he said that. And then the summer came and went, and then I read like 12 novels just to sort of get in that headspace. And then I sat down to write the rest. And in the next 10 weeks, I wrote the rest of the book. And so so it came out quickly. Normally with a short story, I sit with the idea until I start to forget parts. I won't write a word down. I never write anything down. Maybe if I hear something funny on the street, or a conversation, or a takedown, a clapback, you know, something political that I'm just like, oh, why didn't they say that instead? I write that down and I say that's got to make it into the story. And so with this, I did the opposite. I had a general idea that I wanted to write about a town that I had studied in grad school called Roseto, Pennsylvania. And I had a general idea that I wanted to tell a story about people who don't have community and how they're sicker for it, and how the whole town suffers. And that was it. I had themes and characters, and I went home and I got my high school yearbook, and I just started to think about people in my life. I've never been to my high school reunion. What I have in common with the narrator is that I have not kept in touch with anyone I went to high school with. And so this was also kind of fun for me to imagine what became of all these people. And we happen to be that generation, I think, or there's just like 1 year in the last 30 where no one is on social media from that year. And I think it's the year I graduated from high school. So I looked up most of these people and I couldn't find them anywhere. I thought, oh, maybe I'll start to sketch them from this. I couldn't find anyone anywhere. I know they're on Facebook, but I don't have Facebook, and some of them are anyway. My brother would be like, oh, I think I saw so-and-so, or I saw them at McDonald's, and then he would like fill me in a little bit on what happened in their lives. But all of the characters are composites, and then really, I would think of like my best friend or something, and then impute a completely different life into that character. So that's sort of how it came to be. I never wrote down anything, and every time I sat down, I would just keep going further and further and further, which is the exact opposite of the short story. I had it all done in my head, and then I would just kind of transcribe it. So the novel was a little scary in that way. It was freeing, but it was also scary because I kept thinking, am I getting too far away from the center? I had no way of gauging. And I got to at some point when I got to like page 300, I thought, is this still the same novel from the first chapter? I wasn't entirely certain, but I didn't read. I wouldn't allow myself to read ever, which is another thing I don't do with short stories. I always read. When I sit down, I edit what I'd written the day before. And with this, I didn't touch it until the editor said, okay, we're interested in the novel. And then I read it for the first time.
Wow. So then at what point in the writing process did the family that is at the center of it start to kind of crystallize for you? Because you said that you had this idea first that you wanted to kind of tell the story about a particular kind of town.
Yeah. So can I tell you a little bit about that town?
Yeah,
Is that okay?
absolutely.
So about 70 miles west of New York City, there's a place called, or 75 miles west of New York City, there's a place called Roseto, Pennsylvania. And in the late 1800s, 1870 something, it was founded by a group of Italians who'd immigrated from Roseto al Forte, which is in Italy. And they worked in the quarry mines. And the Welsh and the English owned everything and mistreated them, and they were low on the ladder and dealt with a lot of discrimination. And but every house on the few blocks where they lived had 3 and 4 generations of Italians in them. And every house was essentially demographically the same. And they'd come from more or less the same town in Italy. So their trajectory through the American experience was the same. So they had this kind of tight-knit community. What we hear the United States used to be like, I don't know if that's true, but there were definitely pockets within the United States where doors remained open and people all cared for each other. And although life sucked from 9 to 5 or 9 to 9 or whatever it was, when they were home, it was community all around. And this only matters because in the 1950s, 2 doctors were having lunch together, 2 old friends, and one of them was a cardiologist in that town. And he worked at the hospital that served all of the local towns. And he was having dinner with a researcher, or lunch with a researcher friend, and he said, I don't have any work. No one has heart attacks here. No one ever gets sick. And he said, are you kidding? He said, no, really. And he showed him the numbers, and he was a researcher, Stuart Wolf, and he said, I'm going to go visit this town. And so he went to the town, and what they hypothesized was that they were Italians, so they had this Mediterranean diet, where they were all eating, just olives and olive oil and crackers. I have no idea what the Mediterranean diet is. Cheese, feta cheese, I guess. And no, the opposite. Lots of pasta.
No, slice of pizza.
Slice of pizza, right? And no, it turns out they put lard in every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They drank more wine than the average person, than the average American. They were more overweight than the average American. They smoked unfiltered cigars. It was the norm. Like everybody smoked unfiltered cigars. So essentially, what the Surgeon General at the time said were the things we all needed to avoid. They all did. It was part of their daily routine, and yet they lived longer and they had fewer heart attacks and heart disease in general than all of the surrounding towns, which is important to note because the surrounding towns share the same water supply and the same medical facilities. And folks often, I've found, when you go to, I'm getting off track. Folks always think, oh, why is this community healthier than the other? And someone inevitably says, it must be the water. And so, no, it was the same water, but everyone else was unhealthier. They had half the rate of heart disease, which was the biggest killer then as it is now in the United States. And so what the researchers found after interviewing everyone, including the pharmacist who says, the only thing they come in here for is antacid, is that it was their sense of community. They felt so secure with each other. I'm not talking a woo-woo sense of community. I'm actually talking about lower rates of cortisol in the body, right? That speeds up the wear and tear, that kills us all early, or gets us to dialysis before we need to. Anyway, come on in, come sit down. And so and they realized that wasn't going to last. They said this is a relatively new immigrant group to the country. They're tight now, but the next generation is going to want to leave. And once they leave, heart disease is going to match the norm, the average. And they were right. They came back 20 years later to do a follow-up, and all the men had zippers on their chests from heart surgery, and they had no crime either. It was all back to the norm. They were on par with all of the other towns. And so that Rosetto was very influential case study for me when I was in grad school. And I thought about how, wow, nothing describes better the American experience than that right there. How the moment we start to sort of fall into hierarchy and separate and covet what our neighbors have and want the shinier things and the bigger house and leave each other, then our health gets worse. And we become obsessed with health behaviors, and oh, you have to quit smoking, and oh, you have to run, and these are all good things and they're essential. But that town and other towns like it and other societies as a whole show us that actually that's not true. If we were all sort of on the same plane, that would do more for our health than the quote unquote healthy diet and the active routine. So I got to thinking about how I grew up in a town that was mostly Italian on the southern coast of Long Island, but they weren't healthy. And I was Irish, Italian, Catholic, working class, just like Rosetto, except for the Irish part. But my town also had a black neighborhood, which was completely segregated. It was like 6 square blocks. No one ever went there. And we would all meet at church. We were all in the pews together, and those of us who went to Catholic school were in the same classrooms, but otherwise there was no community. It didn't really exist. And so I imagined that I lived in Rosetto after everyone left. And I thought, I'm going to tell that story. So that's how the book came to be. So Babylon initially was a reference to kind of the biblical and mythical Babylon, although a real Babylon exists. I was thinking of, the fable about all of these communities not speaking the same language and not understanding each other and sort of suffering for it, hell on earth in a way. And I was like, only a few people in my life will know that I actually grew up in Deer Park, which is in the township of Babylon, Long Island. The moment I handed that manuscript over to my editor, he wrote the blurb that went out in all the pre-trade publications, or the pre-publication trades. And he was like, about a town in Long Island. And I was like, because I wanted it to be universal. And I think it is in a way. I think I've met a lot of people who've read it who said, oh my God, that's just like my suburb in Denver. So
I kept thinking too about the way that that Rastas use the word Babylon to talk about the kind of the corrupt city that eats you alive, which is certainly the experience for Andres' parents. That they feel like they've accidentally kind of moved into the mall, and you actually use that metaphor in some way, right? That somebody says that they feel like they're sort of at the fang now, like they've, and so but I kept thinking as I was reading this that this is a work of public health, basically. And there's this long tradition of social novels, whether it's Dreiser or The Jungle or Grapes of Wrath, like these novels that were kind of written in many ways to be instructive, as much as entertaining. And I feel like your novel is in a lot of ways kind of in that tradition, because I felt like I learned a lot about public health reading it, actually, and in particular the effect that it has on people who live outside of like what Gail Rubin calls the charmed circle of American life, that people who are not white, who are not rich, who are not straight, that they're kind of punished for this in ways that accumulate physically in the body. And so I guess I just wanted to hear you think some about what you think a work like this gives us that nonfiction can't.
Yeah, thanks. That was top of my mind when I was writing this. And when I started writing, period, I thought my background is in public health. I was doing cancer research and HIV/AIDS advocacy work and teaching, grad school, adjuncting. And I taught a class where public health policy, advocacy, and leadership. And the semester doesn't that sound like a grad school class? And the first part of the semester I would assign op-eds. So whatever the topic was, at the time I was trying to pass a trans health law in New York State, Other times it was, I can't remember what the other topics were, but every year would be a different topic, and the students had to write op-eds, and then we would, so it'd be 25, 35 students, depending on the class, and then they would have to send them out and try and get them published. And every semester we would publish about 6 of them, or they would publish. So we'd have to hit every single paper in the metro area, New York metro area. We never got like a New York Times, but I think we got a Post once, and then a lot of the smaller neighborhood papers. And the students loved it. And the third year or so, I got to thinking, wow, I've never written an op-ed, and here I am teaching people how to write op-eds. Maybe I should try. And so I wrote a couple, and they got published. And then I was like, oh, maybe this is my career. Maybe I just write op-eds and I teach advocacy, and then I was thinking about how there are hundreds of op-eds every week. So many papers, so many opinions on things. And does any of this stay with people? How much of it stays with people? And what are the things that have stayed with me? And really were stories, narrative, movies, books, or even just stories passed down in family. Those are the most effective, I thought, that is the most effective medium for sending some of these messages. So I thought maybe I'll just try and write a screenplay. So I was going to write this screenplay, and a friend of mine said, he's a director. He said, okay, tell me about it. What is it about? And I said, well, it's about a waiter in a restaurant who is commuting home, and he's exhausted, and at one point 2 trains stop in the tunnel side by side, and they can see each other, and he sees one guy kill another guy. He sees them fighting, and then one of them stabs the other one. Very rear window. And then he spends the rest of the book deciding he's not going to go to the police, and he's only talking to the audience about why he's not going to go. And I wrote it all out, and I realized I didn't write a screenplay, I wrote a short story, because I didn't have a template. And so I submitted, and it got published somewhere. I mean, it got rejected someplace too, but like 10 places. And then it finally got published. And then I thought, maybe I have a genre here. Maybe public health fiction is the thing I want to be writing. And the first agent I had said, let's not call it that. And then the second agent said the same thing. But now, I think post-pandemic, I've been telling this, people are like, oh, what a great genre, public health fiction. That's a thing. And that's thanks to the pandemic, for sure. Because that's gotten a shot in the arm. I mean, enrollment in public health schools is up across the board. So I was thinking, how do I do this? And this has kind of been my worst fear, is that I'm writing these really neurotic, obsessive, somewhat annoying characters who are too dogmatic, and they're going to turn off the reader. And I think I am writing that, but I also think there's a place for that character and that voice. And to my surprise, most folks aren't finding him annoying, but some people do, and they write it in their Amazon comments. But I'm okay with that. I think that's actually the voice I want to hone and spend the next few books writing about. Yeah. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. I want to ask you some about structure, I guess. A bit of a nerdy writing question, I guess, but there are 2 really different voices in the novel. There's a first person voice that is Andres talking about his, it's very much in the present tense of him doing these things. But then there's also this other third person voice that kind of crashes into that in all sorts of interesting ways. And for a lot of the novel, they alternate chapters. Although that starts to kind of get a little funky as it goes on. But and as I was reading, I went back and forth about what I thought this third person voice was, and whether it's a kind of just omniscient voice that's you in effect, or whether it's the eponymous town of the novel kind of talking about itself. But it has this kind of mythic register sometimes, where it feels like it's kind of telling a creation myth about how this town comes together, how all of these people ended up here. But it also lets you do some really kind of interesting things, where you see people being sometimes horrible, or sometimes just kind of broke down, and then this other voice comes in that allows you as the author to then give a backstory that this first person voice would never be able to access. And I'm just curious, like, how did you arrive at that? Because it's such an interesting structure, and I think it's a little unusual for a novel to kind of have that. Yeah, how did you stumble on it? Which one came to you first? Did they come together?
I write mostly in the first person because I really want to drive home the kind of anxieties of living in a world where everything is shit and horrible all the time. And so, but your life is great, and then you're just kind of living and everyone else is suffering, it feels like. And that makes for a lot of angst in me, and I wanted to explore that in all of my work. And I feel like it doesn't get explored enough. So that's initially, so I gravitate towards the first person so that I can get away with it and do that. But I agree, I wanted to talk a little bit more globally about the town and the history because of all the things I just told you about public health that I wanted to get in there. And I thought, a short story where you have an erotic writer who goes on and on and on, you can handle because you know the end is coming soon. But for a whole novel, I think we need to pull back and give more history to the town and make the town a voice. So yes, that's what I was thinking. And then in the process of writing, when I took that break between the 3 weeks and the 10 weeks, I read 3 books that stayed with me. One was The Bluest Eye, Toni Morrison. The other was In the Time of Butterflies, Julio Alvarez. And the third was The Dispossessed, Ursula Le Guin. And all 3 of those played with form and voices. And to me, Toni Morrison is quintessential public health writer. I'm sure she didn't think that, but she does that. She is one of these people that you can tell really cares about the motivations for people, not just their choices, but their motivations. And in public health, it's really about like finding disease, and then it's also about changing health behaviors. And so much is like what I was saying before, how are we going to get you to stop drinking? But it's never about, are we going to work towards reparations? With the big system stuff that would make all of the small stuff much easier to deal with. Like, yes, we can work on this illness that you're feeling, but are we going to get the minimum wage to $30 an hour, which, by the way, is what it should be. And so that's not my opinion, by the way. There have been lots of researchers who have shown that if it had stayed in line with from 1969, it would be closer to $30 an hour, and so that it's $7.25 is an embarrassment. And yeah, so I was thinking about how much Toni Morrison in her books, Miss Morrison, would show us these despicable characters from time to time, but they were just really damaged. But you didn't know that, and especially in The Bluest Eye, I can't remember the name of the character, but a person who was a sexual predator and was really, really kind of irredeemable, and then we jump to the past and find out what his story was. And then we realize that we all did that to him. He is who he is because of the rest of us, in a way. Not to excuse what he did, but to understand why he did it. And I thought reading that gave me the freedom to use empathy with my characters and to really do the public health work that I was doing elsewhere, which is trying to understand motivations. So that's where that came from. And then The Dispossessed to me was like, okay, we can talk about the future and really get political, and it's okay, it works. And Alvarez, In the Time of Butterflies, it was just like, and we can be epic, and the perspectives can come from 20 different characters, and it still all comes together. And I didn't have a lot of experience doing that. So those books made me feel like it's been done amazingly, and I can also have a crack at it. Yeah.
Actually, let me just make sure that I'm with the time. Yeah. I just want to ask one more question, and then maybe we can see what everybody else wants to talk about. But I in some ways, the structure of the book is kind of a marriage story, which is a little bit buried in some ways. But when the story begins, the main character, Andres, has had a pretty terrible falling out with his husband. It's kind of not a big deal in a way, but it hurts, and they've decided to take a little bit of time apart. And in a lot of ways, the kind of arc of the story, in the end, ends up being about kind of what it takes to get them back to a good place. But the relationship that we actually see the most of in the book is his relationship with Jeremy, which we just heard an excerpt of the first time that they kind of hang out in private after not seeing each other for 20 years, right? And so there's a kind of interesting bit of like substitution or misdirection, or I don't know really exactly the right word, but there's a way in which we're kind of seeing at a different level one relationship that then tells us something about another one, and vice versa. But yeah, so I guess I don't know exactly what the question is, except that I'd love to hear what you think intimacy does in the book, and how you think these two relationships kind of connect to each other.
Yeah. So for the folks who don't know, there has been an infidelity, and Andres' husband cheats on him, but they've kind of sort of made their peace with that. But there's some misunderstanding that gets alluded to, which is really the cover for him to not go on this trip with him and to come take care of his dad and to be apart for about 10 days or so. And we flash back from time to time to get a better understanding of how that relationship came to be. I think some of that motivation was really digging into the fiction of it all. Andres is not a jealous person. I'm a horribly jealous person. Me, completely and totally jealous. And I enjoy writing non-jealous characters because it allows me to kind of flex a muscle I don't have. And so in part it was that. In part I like the kind of queering of relationships, the idea of opening up a relationship, the ways in which queer couples are more likely, in my experience, to have open relationships or to be able to have those conversations. And although I know plenty of straight couples who are also in open relationships, and I like the idea of exploring that too on the page. And I think I wanted to show how insignificant sex can be, how wonderful it is and enjoyable, but also how it doesn't have to be earth-shattering and carry all the weight that we have been told all our lives that it does. And so that is some of what I was trying to accomplish with those two relationships, juxtaposing them. And part of it is I liked the idea of Andres being free. And again, maybe there I was also projecting, just free enough to be like, yeah, I'm gonna do this thing. I know probably isn't a great idea, but I'm just gonna do it and go with the flow and have this total adventure. And Marcos, from what we know in the book, doesn't seem to care. He's really unaffected by it. He's like, okay, well that's what you needed to do. And I like the idea of a relationship, and I know relationships like that. So yeah, that's sort of what I was trying to explore there a little bit. And maybe also, there's a race part there too that we haven't talked about very much. Jeremy's white, Marcos is black, and Marco is black, and there was something about Jeremy growing up in this white-topia, really, and how it affected who he was and how he sees himself in the world. I didn't want to make too much of a statement, but I liked the idea that in the end he was like, I don't want to be beholden to this experience that Jeremy stood in for. He stood in for that town, right?
Yeah.
And so cutting, or kind of making his decisions about Jeremy was a little bit how he felt about the town in general too.
And I mean, Jeremy certainly suffers in the course of the novel, but as you also are very clear that there's a way in which his whiteness insulates him from a lot of the worst blowback from really bad choices he makes. And there's one part where it like turns out that he has a house upstate, and you're like, this is like peak whiteness, basically. That like you can make all of the horrible decisions in the world and then find out you've inherited a vacation home upstate.
Right. And that scene so they've just had sex, and the wife is at the pool with the kids, and poor Tanya, and we never meet. And they're in bed, and at some point he's like, "This house is kind of familiar to me." And he's like, "Oh yeah, I remember my uncle. We used to like house sit for him. This is him. He died. He didn't have any kids. He left me the house, and he left me the Civil War era guns and the duck decoys, which are really expensive. And with all of that, so he inherited this house, and then with all of that memorabilia, Civil War era guns. Okay, he was able to then buy the vacation house that he refers to, and that was really my way of inserting what I think is a very logical point about why we should be having a national conversation about reparations. And it's because reparations is a backlog of generational wealth that has not been given to Black Americans. It is the money that never came down, that is still coming down on the white side of things. And that explains, that right there explains the black-white wealth gap in this country, with a number of other economic policies, but that's the one that if we really followed through with it and we did it right, would close the gap forever. And so that is just sort of a thing that I do. That's my little bit of advocacy, and I try to include a little point about reparations in everything I write. And so that's where I inserted it there. And I know these people, by the way. Some of them are in my family. Barely finished high school and are somehow inheriting houses and jewelry and getting out of really tough situations. And I don't begrudge them that. It doesn't matter whether you didn't finish high school or you have a PhD in neuroscience. Is that a field? I don't know. But you should always, you should be allowed to live with dignity. I don't begrudge anyone that. But it's fascinating to me. To me, it says it's a myth, the meritocracy that we keep claiming is a part of the American experience. It's a myth because there's always a back door, and so many back doors. Listen, I married well. I went to college, and I went to a good school, a quote-unquote good school, and so I was already surrounded by a lot of people that had way more wealth than I did. And so the likelihood that I was then going to partner up with someone who was better off than I did already increased, and then I did. And, you know, the man that I've been with for the last 21 years is a computer scientist, and that is a kind of a recession-proof, inflated, overly compensated career in our country. I'm grateful for it. It allows me to not be a struggling writer. But yeah, so these things kind of perpetuate. Long-winded, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm happy to just keep asking questions because I could do this all night. But if other people have things that they'd like to ask, I can hand around the microphone, or
You can just yell it out.
Just
You can ask me
yell it
anything
out, yeah.
about the book writing process, about how tall I am. I'm an open book. Or Adam could just keep asking me questions. Started carrying around a notepad because in San Francisco, in the middle of the room, it was crowded, so I got a little extra nervous, and my beta blocker and Xanax hadn't kicked in. For real, I need to take them. And today it only took half, by the way. So, hey. And I, in the middle of it, Brontez Purnell, who's a writer, fantastic writer, 100 Boyfriends. If you don't have that book, please get that book. And he and I acted out the scene. He's also a trained actor and a punk musician, really good. He asked me a question, and midway through it, I was like, what was that question again? Okay, once. The next question came, and I was like, sorry, what was that question again? By the third one, I panicked a little bit, and someone in the audience called out, he asked you about, and I was like, oh God. And so, like, I had this wave of panic shoot through me. I thought, oh my God, I'm dissociating. This isn't gonna work, and I'm gonna have to get up and say I have to go to the bathroom or take some fresh air. I'm so embarrassed. I'm human. Blah blah blah. Forgive me. And then I just, I held on, kept it together. But I thought Plan B will always have one of these. So I've been jotting down just in case. I've been fine, but just in case, every buzzword you say, I'm like, yeah. So that's why I keep taking notes.
I mean, I'm blacking out as I'm asking things also, and so you could really answer anything, and I probably wouldn't even know. Maybe I kind of had moments where I thought this town is the Isle of the Lotus Eaters. You know, like everybody in this town is kind of doping. You know, like a lot of the character. There's a lot of drinking in the book. You know, people are sort of pilling and they're smoking a lot. In some ways, Andres becomes like kind of a different person when he smokes a lot. In a way that kind of allows him to access this like cosmic consciousness.
Yeah.
You know, like there's a kind of shift that happens sometimes where suddenly he's like, you know, he's like a giant and he's able to do these kinds of things that he wouldn't have the temerity to do otherwise. You know, and so I wonder. It's not a book about addiction, but it is a book about how people kind of modify their consciousness to try to get through really shitty situations. And I wonder if you could just talk about why that's so prominent in the book.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of twofold. A little bit, well, I just told you, I'm doing it now, right? I hadn't been on a plane in 7 years before this book tour started 6 weeks ago. I'm afraid of flying. And I turn down jobs all the time because I don't like to public speak. So in order to be doing all of this, I've had to medicate. And always with the hope that by the end, I would be able to wean myself off and not depend on these drugs to be here. And also secretly, I want to run for office in a few years. I'm not kidding. And I thought this would be great. If I could get over my fear of public speaking and really learn to be in front of a crowd and explain myself and my motivations and what I see for the world in the future, who knows? Maybe I'll run for city council in 5 years. It's not going to plan, okay, right now. I'm still way too nervous, I think, to do this. Right now I feel great, but in general, I don't know if I want to do that every single time. But I still have a few more events. Let's see how I feel at the end of this. But yeah, so I think there's something like that. Also, from a public health perspective, we were approaching 81 years life expectancy in the United States on average, which is still pretty low for an industrialized Western nation. And in the last 4 or 5 years, we've dropped to about 79. And most of that was the opioid crisis. The pandemic has contributed, but I'm fairly certain that in about 3 to 4 years, we'll find that the year or two of the pandemic, we actually saw life expectancy increase or hold. And I think it's because of all the egalitarian economic policy that came through. I think it leveled us in ways we haven't yet seen, and that you can't see in 1 year. You see it in 3 or 4 years. So I think that's my guess. But I wanted to show that. Also from personal experience, having grown up in a town of missed expectations, in my own family, folks who didn't break out like they were supposed to, I think there is some of that low-level depression that's always with you when you know what you could have accomplished, or when you know what you were told you could have accomplished and you didn't. And so it's just always sitting there being like, is this my life? I guess this is really my life. Can I have another glass of wine, please? You know, like that. I mean, I think that's real. And so I think that's also a thing that I wanted to show in the town. I've seen it in those towns, in the town I'm from, my own family, my house sometimes, friends for sure. And so, yeah, I think that was some of that self-medication. Sometimes it's just fun, eh?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to make it all about like, oh, it's so sad and horrible. Sometimes drinking and smoking is just fun and nice and it's great.
Yeah. And people self-medicate with food a lot in the book,
Oh, yeah,
too.
yeah.
I mean, Andres' brother kind of eats himself to death in a certain sense.
Yeah.
And his dad, you know, like that's like a great joy for him, is to stop at this restaurant and eat, and his mother, you know, making food for him becomes like a major way that she is able then to show love.
Yeah. Yeah. I grew up in I borrowed a little from my own life and the people in my life when I was growing up. I grew up in a house where folks eat their anxiety away, or just eat when they're anxious. I happen to be the person who cannot eat. I haven't eaten today because I was nervous about this. So during this like 6-week tour, I'm, you know, living a little on like gluten-free protein bars, and I have them when I'm like, I should have something before I go and have a drink with, like, you know, the people after the event. But when I get anxious, I can't eat. But everyone in my family is the exact opposite. When they get anxious, they eat. And it goes on. And I know so many people like that. And when I think of how unfair it all kind of balances out, right? Because the eaters then get judged for the consequences of eating too much. I had no choice in being the person who didn't eat, who doesn't eat when they're anxious. So to kind of then, if you consider that a lot of eating happens in this country as a way of self-medicating also a lot of the depression and the blues and the anxiety and all that, then it's hardly fair to then point to an overweight person and be like, oh my God, you're so slow. Whereas the super thin person, you don't know, that's what my anxiety does to me. Yeah. So, which is why I always say, why focus on the health behaviors when we should be focusing on the up here causes? Because then that would take care of all the manifestations of that thing, whatever it is. Alex, do you want us to stop? Oh yeah. Any questions? Oh yeah, we have a question in the back. We have two questions in the back.
You say you grew up in a small town, Long Island.
Yeah, suburb in southern Long Island. Southern,
How
yes.
close you could say yes?
Sayase. Maybe 25 miles? 20, everything's 25 miles, yeah. About 25 miles. Are you from Sayase?
No, I went, you speaking about that black people in Long Island were separate from white township in
Yeah,
Sayase.
in the town where I grew up, which
Wasn't-
is not Sayase, it was very, very segregated.
And what's the name of it?
Deer Park.
Deer Park?
Yeah.
No, because I went to two weddings in Sayase.
Yeah.
And this family, they had house in Sayase, and a couple had 5 children, and 2 of them got married to black,
Mm.
biracial
Mm-hmm.
marriages,
Yeah.
and even converted to Judaism,
Oh,
which is
wow.
interesting to me because it's so unusual.
Yeah.
So, and I attribute it to, natural lifestyle
Yeah.
of that family.
Yeah. In the book too, I talk about how when Andres goes back now, he notices the mixed race families and the sort of transracial families and how that has changed over time. For sure, in this country, that has changed over time. But historically and actually in lots of places, segregation is still alive and well. And so I definitely pay credit to both in the book. But yeah. Also, I just want to draw attention to the fact that, like, a lot of science and social science research, like, really focuses on what happens in the normal curve, so the average of things, and not the outliers, because the outliers can trip us up. If we start to focus on the exceptions of things, then we say, we don't have a problem because I saw once this thing that happened. But that's what we like to call outliers. But I agree with you that I think that things have been changing, obviously, over the last 60 years in this country.
Even more, because that interracial wedding that I went, it was in 2004.
Right.
June 10, where weddings takes place.
Yeah.
And it was in very nice yacht club.
Mm.
And you now saying instead of talking about segregation,
Yeah.
and Italian family or wherever
Yeah.
mixed Italian and Irish family,
Yeah.
and not Jewish, but whatever your denomination is,
Yeah.
and all that make you to go into public health and write this quite interesting book about real town of Italian descent and that had heart attacks or whatever heart fibrillation or other
Yeah.
heart free
Yeah. But you know, I want to say that I'd like to clarify that. You know how sometimes there are these, like Oliver Stone will make a war film, and he's making anti-war films. He hasn't like hidden that. He'll explain very clearly he was affected by his own service and he's very politically left and he's making anti-war films. But there are many people who will go see his films and say, these are patriotic films. They're pro-war films. That's what they feel. You know, the right and the left fight about Born in the USA all the time, right? Bruce Springsteen wrote a song that's critical of the United States foreign policy and the Vietnam War, but the right sees it as a patriotic song. And so there are sort of different interpretations of you know, the same art. You can look at it and see it any number of ways. I wanted to tie that better to what you were saying, but see, it happened. I lost my way. Thank you. Yeah, in the back there. Hi.
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 Hi. Thank you for saying that you told me last time you are open book, so that really gave me the courage to ask a question.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about that you are rejected a few times from the publishing
Yeah.
company. And I'm a fiction book writer in my native language, and now I'm working on the English version, so I am in the same situation.
Yeah.
So how did you overcome?
It's very rarely happened in my life, but I had a kind of a feeling, confidence. I thought I'd written something worthy, and I had enough people in my life that said, this is pretty good. And I still feel I haven't written anything great, except my story in Harper's. If anyone, you should read that story. I think it's pretty great.
Your Boston Review story is great.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. But this book feels like a damn good book, and I think the next few are going to be great. I'm working on it. Also, I'd like to have goals. But yes, but my point was that I think I just believed this is going to happen. This is going to happen with a really small press. This is going to happen with a big press, but it's going to happen. And so the first rounds of rejections were from the big presses. But my agent is a tiger. I mean, he really won't stop. And so he said, I'm going to do it. I'll go back to the same. And there's so much turnover in the industry. He's like, I'll go back to the same places. And he kept going. And the third time he went. My agent, when he sold the because we sold the book and the collection at the same time, he called me crying. He said, I knew you were going to sell this. And I'm not making fun of you, Robert. I was very moved by it. But he was really invested, and I didn't realize how invested he was. For him, it's like he believes in it, and if you find an agent who believes in you, or an editor who believes in you, they're going to make it happen, because they really feel quite strongly about it. And so I was fortunate in that way. Thank you. Yes?
How can we read your stories in Harper and Boston Review?
Yes, alejandrovarela.org. That's my website, and so you can find the links to all of the stories there, with the exception of 2 that were only in print. They weren't available online.
The Boston Review one is online for free.
Yeah.
So you can just find it, and I think the Harper's you can preview it probably. For
You can
free,
read in
right?
Harper's for free if you haven't already used your 3 free clicks. So if you haven't been to Harper's in a long time, I think every month you get 3 clicks.
Or open an incognito browser.
Right. Incognito browser is always helpful. Anyone else? Thank you.
Thanks.